Just give me a wee thumbs up. Brilliant. Okay, so yeah, this is an introductory session. So what is PB? And we'll touch on a little bit about planning your PB process. So some things that you might want to add as a sort of checklist, but we'll provide that at the end. So these slides we'll give to you at the end of this as well, so you've got it. Okay. So, participatory budgeting is a democratic way for people to have a direct say on how a budget or public money is spent. So that's used in Scotland. I know there's different ways of sort of saying it in different languages. There are a range of different models of PB used across the world, so different examples everywhere. PB processes can be instigated by decision makers like governments, local government or services, even schools or communities. So it doesn't need to be as broad as that. It could actually be on a quite small local level. In some countries, so like Scotland, for example, there are national policies in place to ensure PB and community empowerment are taken seriously and becomes part of everyday practice in how we do things. So typically, PB processes include, but they're not limited to, so setting up steering groups to co-design a process, working together and thinking through that design, theme and criteria setting, so we'll talk a little bit about that this afternoon and go into more detail on that. Idea and proposal generation, same again, we'll talk a little bit more about ways that you can do that this afternoon. Dialogue, debates, conversations or deliberation. So you might have heard of things like citizen juries or citizen assemblies. That's a deliberative process. Reduction of ideas, so sifting down those ideas based on maybe the criteria that you've set. Voting or consensus, so having a final decision about which proposals or which projects should go through. And then, of course, communication and implementation of selected proposals. And these sort of practical elements can be done online, in person, or a combination of both online and in person. It's also important to note that the design of a PB process doesn't have to be done in that order. It can be designed to suit the specific needs of what you're trying to do in your local context. So this is a Scottish thing, but just to give you a bit of context. So in Scotland, there's a thing known as the PB Charter, which sets out 7 key features just to show what's a fair and high quality PB process. So people sort of use that as a sort of guide on how to make a PB process. So that includes being fair and inclusive, participatory, deliberative, empowering, creative and flexible, transparent, and then part of our democracy as well. And there's a wee link at the bottom if you'd like to have a wee look at that. But obviously that's Scotland's context, which Corin you'll know all about. But so some of the PB benefits and purposes of PB. So there's a lot, but I'm just going to focus on these 3. So community building, so that's stronger and more resilient communities. Better solutions, so working together can actually lead to improved outcomes. And then increased trust and community power in decision making. So those, I think, are the 3 sort of big main ones that we'll touch on, but it's not to say that there aren't more sort of benefits than that. So community building, for example, people can set their own agenda. They've got an ownership of the process that they're running. It can actually help build new productive relationships, perhaps between local authority or different members in the community. And that, again, can strengthen social relationships and communities. Political trust, so things like openness and transparency about how money works and how public resources work. Not everyone in the community might understand that process, so opening that up to people and sort of that education element can help build trust. So that transparency in decision making, how decisions are being made, insight and support for policy choices, so having that understanding and then supporting how that works. It can strengthen political engagement, so things like voting, local elections, that kind of thing. So you might do a PB process and then you find that actually people are more engaged the next time you do it, the next year. So it kind of tests how your local society is doing as well. And then legitimacy of political decisions, because obviously you've got a group of people that have also supported an idea, so maybe you've got more people that have agreed that that should go through. So that decision, again, it kind of goes back to that stronger decisions. Yeah, better solutions. So it kind of brings in all the knowledge and creativity and energy of the community. Tailored solutions, so it might suit a specific local area that wouldn't necessarily suit somewhere else. And you can get unexpected solutions because people are thinking outside the box. They're thinking outside sort of regulations and policy frameworks that are set, and better ways of doing things that you would never have thought of otherwise. So I've touched on this a wee bit, but steps of PB, and it's not limited to, so I do want to sort of stress that more steps can be added. Some of these you might not include, but these are the typical sort of steps that you would use when you're running a PB process. So design, inclusion and accessibility, I would say, is obviously the most important. You need to design your process and you want to ensure it's inclusive and accessible to people. So design includes all the decisions that you will need to make in order to deliver an effective PB process. It can include reviewing the scope of the PB. So things like you might have statutory duties within your local authority in relation to a fund. So if it's focused on, I don't know, poverty or equalities, there might be things that you have to do to set, it has to be included in that design and that criteria that you're setting. So that also can sort of someone got their hand up. You okay? Is everyone okay with my accent? And I know Corin, you are, but is it okay to keep going? Just give me a wee thumbs up. Brilliant. Where was I? Yeah, so setting goals, your theme, so you might have a specific theme in mind. It might be a service that you actually want to run a PB process around. A specific budget, thinking about scale. So scale is the size of the budget, whether it's at city level or neighbourhood level. You might want to think about co-design, so how you can bring in other people into that design of the process. Setting criteria, thinking about who is eligible to participate. So that might be different ages, different groups of people in different neighbourhoods. The type of idea generation you want to run, the type of voting, the length of the process. So this includes pretty much everything that you want to include in your design, and also thinking about how you can make that process more innovative. So you might have ran a process the year before or the years before. How can you add to it and make it a little bit more interesting for people, or how can you test new ideas out that you've not tried out before? And of course, with any design, accessibility and inclusion should be included from the outset. So, and I guess to make sure that you're not excluding people from the process and any elements that come after it. Communications and recruitment as well. So thinking about how you'll communicate to people what is PB, what is the PB process, how can I get involved, why is it meaningful, and why should they get involved. So consider how you will actually recruit people to participate as well. So thinking about who will be involved in that work. So design, so maybe people want to design things like posters or little films or anything like that. Admin, so maybe people, you need people in the sort of admin side to help with that. A steering group for accountability as well. So how can you recruit and communicate how you'll get people in a steering group along? What does that involve? How much time will they need to sort of allocate? So there's lots of things around communications and recruitment. So I guess the main one is obviously, what is PB? Why is it meaningful? And why should I get involved? Idea generation. So we'll touch on this afternoon a bit more in detail, but this just involves thinking about how people can propose ideas and proposals based on the criteria you've set and the budget you've set. And this can be done online, in person, or a combination of both. And it might be a specific theme that you've based it on as well. So after you've got sort of a set of proposals, you might have, 100 proposals, 100 ideas that have come through. You might want to reduce those ideas down so that it's not 100 ideas going to a final vote. So this sort of screening proposals and reduction of proposals, typically you compare to your criteria that you've got. And this is reduction of ideas and checking them to see and who's part of this process depends on your design, because you could actually have a sort of citizen group that actually reduce the proposals, or it could be members of your local authority that do that as well. Voting or consensus. So this is how decisions are made, how the final decision is made on the proposals and which proposals should be implemented. And I believe we've got a workshop going in more detail on that next week as well. Obviously the final stage, implementation. So how proposals are implemented, but how the community are also given feedback on how they've been implemented and the progress that has been made. So that's really important to give that feedback loop to people. Okay, I'm just going to touch on very briefly just some examples of different types of PB, international examples. Can I just check, is everyone okay? I hope I'm not speaking too fast and I'm understandable. Just give me a wee thumbs up if it's okay. Yep, brilliant.
I'm fine.
Brilliant, thank you. So PB in Antwerp, so this is in Belgium. And it was our colleague as well, so we might get her along to run a sort of more in detail about Antwerp if you're interested in this case study. So they run a highly deliberative PB process. Participants could deliberate about choices in every step of the process. So using a consent method, consensus, so deciding together at each point. So participants would choose their first topics, then divide budgets over those topics, and then projects. So they actually used a sort of board game technique with poker chips to make it a little bit more fun about how to do that. And it was a combination of offline and online methods. And I think what they found is people who sort of weren't really sure about coming along to an in-person event, they're a bit nervous maybe to just sort of turn up and they didn't know what to expect, but they might have participated online and had a wee look at what it was. And then from the online, they ended up coming along to the in-person event because then they sort of got a grasp of what it was about. So it's quite an interesting learning, as they weren't sure what was going to happen with that. So online actually helped the in-person events. So they had a big budget. So that was 1.4 million euros, so that's 10% of the budget, which is quite big, and that meant it was real decision making power. So it was a big budget, mainstreaming, so it's large, and it affected the real decisions. And I'm just going to move on to Vienna. So this is currently being worked on. They're sort of focusing more on green PB, so a climate focus around this. So social just transition. So it's a strong focus of the process and political. So inclusion of people that are most affected by climate change. So bringing in people that are most affected by it. And making silos dance. So the PB is a lever for governance and innovation and working cross silos. So that's their sort of focus around this. And they want to include people in the concept development, so bringing people into the design. And I think what they're doing is they're making it a little bit more deliberative as well by running citizen juries, just to do that design and that final idea generation. However, it's still in the design processes, so this is quite a new case study. And their advisory board, so they've brought in representatives from civil society, so people from all over, so it's a little bit more representative of people, a little bit more inclusive of people. This is where I don't want to throw Corin in it, but a part of me wants to just go, oh, Corin, tell us about Fife. But PB in Scotland is another example. So this is done a little bit more on a wider scale. We've got a thing known as mainstreaming PB, which is a commitment from the Scottish Government and COSLA made in 2017, and it's 1% of public budgets to be allocated through PB. So it means scaling up the PB. So typically it was done on sort of a community grant model, maybe smaller budgets, but now that's been broadened, so it's actually a lot of money around public services and local resources. So this is across 32 local authorities in Scotland. So it's a wider scale, but at a local level, if that makes sense. Obviously, I mentioned the community grant model, so this was typically done through community choices funding. So it's done on a much smaller scale, maybe at a community or sort of more local level on a smaller scale to decide on priority themes and local projects in a community based on what their needs are. Youth-led PB, so this has been done and it's being done in the future as well. So through things like reducing the voting age. So actually people have thought, well, why not actually just include children and young people into the normal PB, so the local authority PB processes. So in some local authorities, they've just reduced the age to about 8 years old, and they've worked in schools and things like that to involve young people into the processes. However, there's also just youth-specific PBs as well as that, so it's a bit of a mix at the moment. So that's Scotland. I'm just going to touch on planning your PB now. I just want to check in with you if you've got any questions before I move on. If everyone's okay, you can just give me a wee thumbs up. Brilliant, okay. Okay, planning your PB. So I mentioned at the start, but I think there's no single right way to do PB. Obviously, it's good to follow a sort of set, thinking through your goals and guidelines and things like that. But from how you plan to generating proposals and voting and stuff like that, it can all be done differently from different places. So just to think that and acknowledge that every PB can look different from another organisation or another city. So I'm just going to touch on this a wee bit. So I think the first thing to sort of consider is, why are you doing it in the first place? What is your goal out of it? This is a starting point for designing a process. It'll help you think through, how can I involve people? So how can I ensure everyone is involved, citizens, other stakeholders, your colleagues? How can I ensure that they're all on the same page? And you want to design a process that matches these aims and purpose. You might also want to think through where digital tools, thinking through accessibility, how can you bring in elements to make sure as many people as possible can be included into the process. And again, developing communications that match these purposes that can help inform your overall comms and engagement strategy. So if you've got your goal, you can kind of think, right, how am I going to communicate that to people? And then this can also help you develop key indicators to aid in your evaluation. So I think the PB Charter is quite a good example of that. It had the 7 sort of key points, and you can kind of use things like that as key indicators to aid in your evaluation. So this is one example. New York City, they had these publicly stated goals, so they shared them out with everyone. This is what we want to achieve. So empowerment, enabling local people to decide how PB works in their communities and across the city. Transparency, so sharing information and make decisions as openly as possible. Inclusion, so making special efforts to engage people who face obstacles to participating. So it might be that they're often excluded or disillusioned, they maybe don't trust government. And equity, so ensuring that the decision-making process is accessible to every person. And then community, so bringing people together across traditional lines of division to work together for the good of the whole community. So designing your PB, this is a wee bit of a checklist, and we'll share these slides with you after, but I'll just touch on this as well. So you might want to think about scale. PB processes, they can be small or large scale. It might be at city level or neighbourhood level. So you might have multiple neighbourhoods doing smaller PBs, but all connect up to a shared goal. And that can include small or large budgets. So scale includes the region, so which region, but also budget. So 2 things there. Ongoing as well. So is it a one-off or continuous process? So it might be annually reoccurring, and you might want to sort of develop it as each year as it goes on. Clear topic and questions, so ensuring that these are really easy to understand for people. So what is the goal? What's the topic? What are you asking me? Making sure that's really clear for everyone involved. And then participants' influence over the outcome. So this is really important as well. So what influence do people have? Are they making the final decision, or are they just inputting? So just making that very clear to people, what is happening with their decision making or their ideas. And then access to information, so ensuring that deliberations or decisions are informed. So that might be through things like experts coming in and giving some presentations, or providing some information about a certain topic and explaining a little bit about what's been going on with that. Making that very clear to people as well before they propose ideas on the topic. You can inform them a little bit about why you're asking them to provide ideas and talk about it. So this is another interesting one, is the selection of participants. So it might be that you want to target a specific group of people. So mentioned earlier, there's specific youth PB processes that can happen. So that might just be a specific school that you want to target, or a specific area of a neighbourhood or something like that. And how many people do you want to reach as well? So that's another important thing to consider. And of course, considering diversity and representativeness as well. So this is another wee thing, budget. So some people say, oh, I can't do a PB because I don't have a budget. One example is Madrid. So they have a sort of ongoing PB. Although they know that there's a budget coming in the future, what they did was sort of gathered ideas, gathered people's priorities, sort of set priorities and created proposals, knowing that there would be a budget in the future, so that budget could be allocated based on the ideas. So it's not to say the first or the second is, which one's right. It's just to say that there's more ways you can do it than one, if that makes sense. Typically, a PB is done with a budget, so you've got a budget and then you run a PB process. But it can be done the other way around as well. You could run a PB process knowing that there's a budget coming, or you might need to wait a little bit and know that these are the priorities of the community, and then you run the idea generation and the voting as you've got that budget come in. So there's different options to consider around this as well. So of course, accessibility is really important as well. Ensuring diverse participation, so considering things like cost and time. Can people access the venue? Can people, if they can't come along because it's during a work week or something like that, how can they get involved? And things like access costs as well. So do you need to provide any of those budgets for inclusion? Process governance and role of participants in the process. So this is things like how is the process being ran? Who's making the decisions? You could actually think, how can I bring in people from my community, so citizens that can actually have a say in this process. So mentioned that earlier, you could have a citizen steering committee or a citizen advisory group, like in the case of Vienna, that can help make these decisions or advise what you're doing and if it'll work for the local area that you're doing the PB in. Space. So this is another thing. Will it be online? Will it be on person, or maybe a bit of a hybrid, considering as well? Method of voting and decision making. So if it's deliberative or not, you might be running a citizens jury or a citizens panel or a mini public or something like that, to make it a little bit more deliberative and have sort of smaller group conversations with people. Voting, and then monitoring quality standards. So things like feedback, inclusion, how are you monitoring your goals and what you're doing? Have you achieved your goals? Is it accessible? Is it inclusive? Are you building trust with the community? What's going on? So it's good to monitor those as you go along. And then, of course, thinking about conditions and restrictions. So if you've got funding restrictions or regulatory standards that you need to adhere by, how is that going to impact your design? So this is another thing to consider, who from your organisation should be involved. So it might be people that you don't necessarily expect to be involved. Maybe they are from, you've got a PB that you want to run in a specific policy area, and maybe you need to bring in more people that have got more expertise in that area. So considering that, who, and then how can you bring in wider perspectives from outside your organisation, and how can you bring those who you hope to impact with the PB process? So it might be disengaged people in your community, what would be a good method, or thinking through techniques and bringing them in, just making it very clear to them, how can you bring them into the conversation and the design? And that can have the following impacts. So an increased range of perspectives in designing the process can lead to smarter design. So identifying new challenges and creating interventions to challenge these. Increasing trust, developing advocates for the process so they can actually go out to the community and share the word. I'm doing this and it's been successful. It's been a good, valuable process. Increase the sense of ownership that the community has. So bringing people in from the start can actually have some positive impacts that can sort of drip feed out into the wider community. Yeah, some more checklist things, understanding the work involved. So who and how will you manage the process throughout? That's probably the biggest thing. So who's doing it and how are you going to do it? Are you on top of legal considerations like data protection? How will you be promoting the process? So again, communications. How will you recruit people? How will you keep things transparent? So thinking through your feedback loops. How will you update people on what's going on with their proposals? How are project proposals going to be generated? So is that going to be an online idea generation method, or is it in person where people work in groups around a table? Is it a theme or service? So I've mentioned these before. And then how will you facilitate and moderate discussions? Do you have trained staff in your team that can do that? And how is funding going to be allocated? And again, this is another really important thing to communicate at the very start of the process. So once citizens have reached a decision, is this decision binding? So it's important for them to know that, otherwise it might feel like a sort of meaningless project or proposal that they've put in if they know that it might not go ahead. Or so just knowing what is happening with their input. And yeah, utilising existing activity, people and resources. So if there's already community meetings or opportunities there to bring, or maybe bringing in decision makers alongside your community. So thinking about how you can sort of bring people together and utilising that knowledge as well. So there might be other engagement activities happening, or other parts of your organisation that you could partner with to make it a little bit easier. And then how is digital already being used by your organisation in terms of engagement? So thinking through communications again and recruitment, how is that already being done? Is it working well? How could that be improved? And maybe how can you tap into your sort of IT systems as well? And evaluation. So obviously measuring against your key indicators. This is probably really important. How will you capture any lessons learned throughout the process? And then I love this image because it's try, fail and success. Obviously you might, things might go wrong the first time you do it, but you'll learn. And then the next time you do it, hopefully it's a success because you can use that learning for the next time. And then these are just some challenges to consider, but we will touch on these in future workshops, but I'm not going to go into detail on this because I'm conscious of time and I'm going on. So I'm going to stop there and I'm going to pass over to Sophie.